Welcome back. In our last lecture, we discussed how to get started on a research project. As a model, I gave you the research assignment that I typically assign my undergraduate Arthurian literature course. But the strategies that we walked through last time are easily applicable to a magazine article, a short story, or some kind of presentation, whether it's in public or at the office. We talked last time about how to find a hook or a way into your research in order to get yourself started. We also discussed the pros and cons of using the internet, the powerful search tools available in libraries, and the importance of paying attention to what's around a particular book once you locate it on a library shelf. Finally, we discussed the importance of having some kind of schedule. While a research and writing schedule will often change as you go along, it's important to have some kind of idea when you're going to do what, at least as a guideline, at the very least. And now that you've mastered some of the basics of finding information, you need to start figuring out how to keep track of it. Everybody works and thinks differently, so it may be a matter of doing this a few times before you figure out which style of information storing and sorting fits with your personality and your research style. The most important and helpful and useful advice I can give you when it comes to researching actually has nothing to do with the means by which you're going to organize all the volumes of data you accumulate. Rather, the most important piece of advice I can give you is simply start early. In exchange for your audience's time and interest, you have an obligation to know what you're talking about. So you actually have to really know your subject. No matter what your task or what you're writing, starting early is still important. This means you need to read up on your topic. You need to absorb the information. Then you'll need to reread and review a lot of your research materials so that you have an understanding of what other points of view on your particular topic are. Then, after you've done that, you need to be able to articulate your own position in respect to those other points of view. And then you have to make a convincing case as to why your particular focus or your argumentative position or your arrangement of information is important or useful or answers a particular question. If you start researching at the very last minute, then pretty often the materials you're reading become texts that you aren't really engaging. Rather, what you often end up doing is trolling through them quickly, looking for quotes or citations that you can then make fit into whatever you've decided your argument is going to be. This is what happens if you begin a research paper 2 days before it's due. On day one, you end up reading things and jotting down quotes that you think you can use in your paper. And in day two, you sort of mash that all together into something that resembles a research essay. And let me just say, I have read plenty of these in my time as a college professor, and the haste always shows. Now, on the other hand, this 2-day intensive approach could be a good way to establish a working outline or a rough draft of your paper, but by no means should it be the way that you produce your final essay or final version of your article or your short story or whatever it is that you're working on. Consider the following 2 paragraphs, which I've lifted from research papers on roughly the same topic. This is the topic we discussed in our last lecture. And as you'll remember, we examined several possible thesis statements in an attempt to find one that would work well for a research paper. What we finally came up with as a guiding idea for our research was, quote, "the significance of the shift in King Arthur's character once he has founded the Order of the Round Table." Okay, so here's the opening from one of these sample papers. Quote, "When Mallory's novel begins, King Arthur isn't even born yet, but we know that he is supposedly destined to be a great king. He doesn't start out that way, but eventually, as everyone knows, he pulls the sword from the stone and takes the throne. In order to stay on the throne, he has to fight a lot of wars, but once he gets married and founds the Round Table, he stops being active and pretty much disappears from the story, as a lot of people have pointed out. Okay, so what does this paragraph do well, and where does it fall short? Well, we get a pretty clear idea of what the author is going to be writing about, and what the author is focusing on is how King Arthur's character is one way before he founds the Order of the Round Table, and then it seems to change afterward. How does this writer use research to convince you of his position? You may have noticed that aside from a comment like, "everyone knows," or something like, "as a lot of people have pointed out," we don't get any indication that the writer has done any research at all. These statements are vague, and while they might be true, the lack of any indication of specific research to support them weakens the argument as a whole. Also, with the first sentence, this writer has set himself at a disadvantage in that he refers to Sir Thomas Malory's text as a novel. And I see my undergraduates do this all the time. They refer to any piece of writing as a novel. The Morte d'Arthur, the text that's under discussion here, predates the modern period and the rise of the novel, so it's not proper to refer to it in this way. This might seem like a minor detail at first, but it actually is really important. Now, would you expect most people to know this fact? Absolutely not. But would you expect someone who's done research on Malory's text to know this? Absolutely. And certainly the audience for this paper, in this case, the college professor, which is me, would know this. So what it tells me from the very first words is that this person obviously didn't do any kind of substantial research. So the writer starts off at a disadvantage in terms of earning my respectful attention or a good grade because the writer demonstrates that he just hasn't done his homework. Now let's consider a different version of this same opening. Quote, Arthurian scholar Alastair Eminent was arguably the first to state that the character of King Arthur in Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur starts off as naive and ill-prepared when he assumes the throne. And here there's parentheses, and it says Malory's Morte, page 95, close parentheses. Then the passage continues. Other scholars, such as Arabella Distinguished, have described King Arthur's actions late in the text as, quote, inadequate and even, quote, embarrassing. And there's another parenthetical citation of a source, the character of the king, page 187. And the passage continues. Between these two stages, however, there is a period when King Arthur acquits himself admirably in his role as ruler. The major shift in Arthur's character comes not when he assumes the throne, as James Oxford and others have suggested, again another parenthesis with a page citation, but rather it occurs at the moment when he creates the Order of the Round Table. This paper will explore the events that lead up to the founding of the Round Table and Arthur's active role in this, and then examine the striking contrast in the king's character later in the text when his knights have essentially become the major players in Malory's narrative. Okay, so which paper do you think is going to wind up being the more impressive of the two? I hope that most of you right now are thinking, well, paper 2, of course. And why is this? Well, from the opening lines, this writer establishes herself as an authority. She makes it clear that she's read significant scholarship on her topic, and she's able to cite specific critics and texts to support some of the key points she's making here. Not only does she cite scholars and texts, but at times she also quotes directly from them, and she does what any responsible researcher should do. She then gives the title of the work cited and the page or pages on which the quoted material can be found. Now, the style of citation, as I've given it to you here, obviously it comes across a little bit awkwardly when I'm trying to read the passage aloud and then let you know where a citation falls in that passage. But this style is something called MLA citation, and you might remember that MLA stands for Modern Language Association. They're considered one of the major authorities when it comes to research and writing of an essay like this one. In the last lecture, you'll recall I mentioned the MLA bibliography as a great resource for doing research in the humanities. And in fact, at Purdue University, where I teach, all students taking Introduction to the Major which is English 301, are required to have on hand at all times the MLA Handbook. There are lots of other guidebooks that can help you when you're working on a research project. The Chicago Manual of Style, the APA Guide, and there are many others, many of which are geared toward one specific kind of publication or writing or another. You absolutely should check and see what the standard is in whatever discipline or market in which you're writing so that you can give your teacher or your editor or your boss a piece of writing that conforms to basic rules of style that are considered proper for the area in which you're working. Okay, so you might be thinking, this person has obviously done a lot of research. How did she not only manage to take in all this info, but also then organize it in such a way that it flows so nicely throughout her opening paragraph? Because in order to cite properly, you need to be able to find the quote you have in mind. It does you absolutely no good. Trust me on this one. No good if you think, I remember that being in the middle of some book that had a brown cover, and then you spend precious time searching for it. I have been there. And while I'm thumbing through every book that I own with a brownish cover for over an hour, as it turns out, I was mentally cursing myself for not taking better notes. So how do you make sure that doesn't happen to you? Well, again, leaving yourself enough time is really key here. If you're in the early stages of your project and not quite sure what particular approach you want to take to a particular topic, you might start with reading through the material you've collected and using tabs or sticky notes to identify pages that contain material you find interesting and that you consider relevant to your topic. And as I've said before, when you're doing this, it's worthwhile to pay attention to footnotes and the works cited sections in your research material. Maybe a particular article you've photocopied from a journal doesn't have anything germane to your subject, but the footnotes may direct you to other texts that do. So don't overlook this often overlooked section of a piece of research when you're conducting your own. After you've gone through an initial reading of your material, it's time to take more detailed notes. And there are a couple ways to do this. The way I tend to work is by taking notes on a particular text, either in longhand or on the computer. And when I do this, I try to sum up a scholar's general argument and then note particularly interesting points individually, making sure to identify on which page they appear. When I've worked my way through taking notes on a text, I either print the typed notes or I staple my handwritten notes all together. So when it comes time to start the drafting process, I can read through my notes to remind myself what's important about a particular article or book rather than having to reread the whole text. And when I'm taking notes on a particular text, I am always careful to really carefully write down my own questions or counter-arguments as they come to me so that I don't forget a flash of insight. So let's say, for example, if I'm reading an article on something like gender and Mallory's text, I might write something in my notes like, my question, this author keeps talking about the female character of Guinevere, but I think that maybe the character of Morgan Le Fay, Arthur's half-sister, is more interesting when it comes to gender. Another variation on this note-taking approach would be what I call the note card version. And many of us probably learned some form of this in high school. It's pretty much just what it sounds like. You've got a stack of 3x5 note cards, and each single card gets a quote or the note of an important argumentative point from a particular author. In the top corner of the card, you should also designate who the author is, the text this idea or quote comes from, and then the page number on which you found it. Now, the benefit of this approach is that it's a little more flexible than direct note-taking onto sheets of paper that you staple together. You can shuffle the cards so that, let's say you decide you want to further organize your research by subpoints. In other words, let's imagine you want to group together what all the scholars you've read had to say about maybe how Merlin helps King Arthur rule. And then you also want to group together what some scholars say about the moment of the founding of the Round Table. You can do this pretty easily by drawing out the individual note cards and then regrouping or restacking them. And as long as you've identified on every single card from what text or author each point or quote is coming, then it's going to be no trouble to arrange, rearrange, and then put them back in order. I actually had a friend who took this kind of organization to new heights. He got some colored stickers, and he assigned each secondary source a particular color. And the colors for the sources went in the lower right-hand corner of each card. Across the top, he also had colored stickers, but the stickers on top corresponded to particular themes or points. So, for example, he might assign every quote that had something to do with knighthood a green sticker, every quote that had something to do with gender a blue sticker, warfare got a red sticker. Some cards had 3 different colors of sticker because it was a quote or a point that related to all of these. If he was looking for basic info, he didn't even need to read the cards themselves before he sorted them into piles that he thought were relevant for his research. Now, if you're thinking that this sticker system thing might turn into way too much work or might become a procrastination technique, you are, of course, right. But some people need this kind of organization to really get their paper into shape. And there's something to be said for the act of reading and rereading your notes. Eventually, some of what you're reading over and over and over again sticks, and gradually, you become an authority on your topic. Now, when you're organizing your research into an article or a presentation, one of the trickiest things is to make your voice and your argument heard while using the work of other people, other scholars or experts as a means of support. You want to make your research support your idea, but you need to give proper accreditation where it's due. Now, this is pretty easy if your goal is simply to gather the most important or latest information on something and present it to someone else. It's a little trickier if you're trying to make an original argument, if you are trying to claim a new idea, but you need to use the work of others as a foundation on which you build your own research. The best way to generate an original argument for a research project is, after doing your research, decide what your particular stance is on a topic, and then try and articulate your claim or position and do a really rough overview or outline indicating where supporting points could be helped by the use of secondary sources. And when you're doing this, you absolutely need to identify critics or scholars who've expressed opinions that disagree with your own. One trap that I often find students falling into is when they come across a piece of scholarship that has a point of view that is counter or in opposition to what they want to argue, they just ignore it. They leave it out entirely and they never mention it. For example, if we go back to our example of the Arthurian research paper, you might imagine that in their research, these 2 hypothetical students come across a scholarly article that argues that the key moment of transformation in the character of King Arthur is not when he founds the Round Table, but rather it's when his mentor and his advisor Merlin disappears from the text. The students might think, this person doesn't agree with the point I'm trying to make. I'm not going to use this resource because I'm afraid I might get into trouble, as I really want to make the opposite or different argument. Okay, that is exactly the wrong thing to do. First, for a responsible researcher, this constitutes a lie of omission. When you're conducting research for whatever kind of writing, you need to clearly articulate the scope of the argument you're trying to make, and you also have to establish what other people have said about it, and not just the other people who happen to agree with you. Probably right now, you can all think of any number of political ads that do just this, that have these lies of omission. They pick and choose facts and details. They omit context or important counter-arguments. And I will tell you right now that if we held political ads to the standards of ethical research and reporting, almost all of them would get an F. The other thing is, sometimes an opposing view or counter-argument can help you prove your own point. Our hypothetical students might write something like, although Professor Eminence has argued persuasively for the disappearance of Merlin as a key moment in the transformation of Arthur's character, I will demonstrate that, in fact, it is the founding of the Round Table, which is the most important single event in King Arthur's reign. And the other thing that's nice is that this can provide you with a workable structure. Essentially, you could write with this in mind. Here's Professor Eminence's first point. Here's why I think it's wrong. And here's what I think is really the key point for reasons X, Y, and Z. Now we'll go on to the next point, which might explain how someone might think it's right. And now, let me show you why that next point that someone else believes, let me show you why it's wrong. So you can use counter-arguments as a way of structuring your own argument. Now, one of the major concerns and dangers when doing a research paper is the issue of plagiarism, and you need to avoid this at all costs. In a nutshell, plagiarism is using the words or ideas of others without giving proper credit where credit is due. Now, there's obvious outright plagiarism, which is usually easy to recognize, and that's if someone were, say, to buy a term paper online or download it off the internet and then try and pass it off as his or her own writing. This is usually pretty easy to spot, especially as a college professor. I mean, if suddenly your student is writing about moments in the poem Beowulf that we never discussed in class, or the student is using vocabulary that just doesn't sound like him or her, it tends to make your audience, and in this case that'd be me, the professor, a little suspicious. Now, I highly doubt that anyone who's listening to this course would ever consider doing such a thing, but all of us who do research can be prone to accidental plagiarism, and this is what you have to guard against most vigilantly. Here's how this can happen. Let's say you've taken lots and lots of notes, you've read lots and lots of books and articles on your subject, and you become a kind of authority on the topic. This is great, because it means that you've internalized and processed much of what you've been reading. The danger for some people is that your original thoughts on a particular topic somehow get blended in or mixed up with what other scholars have to say. And as you're reading over those notes or the note cards, you might forget, was I writing down what this scholar said about Beowulf or Malory or Ralph Waldo Emerson? Or are these my words, my reaction to what I was reading? This is why you have to be so incredibly careful when you're taking notes on a particular text, and that's why I always distinguish when something is my thought. I gave you an example of that earlier when I said, here's my idea. And you can just write it out. You say something like, Professor Eminence says X, but I'm thinking Z is the more important question. And right there, you've gone ahead and you've said, this is what the expert thinks, this is what I think, and the two ideas are distinct from each other. This is why I tend to note down direct quotes by putting quote marks around sentences or phrases I find important. Or if I'm paraphrasing, I might write something like, Professor Eminence spends 2 pages discussing the history of Malory scholarship, focusing particularly on where early 20th century scholars went wrong. Now, when it comes to my research, I might be in full agreement with Professor Eminence's thinking about how early 20th century scholars were wrong in a particular area. And I can say that, but I also need to cite Professor Eminence as having made this argument first. Even if I arrive at a conclusion or position on my own, independent of another scholar, once I start doing research and I discover that other scholars have already observed this point, I need to make sure that I give credit where it's due. And actually, far from being discouraged when you discover that what you thought was an original insight on your part has in fact already been a point that someone else has made, you should be encouraged that you seem to be thinking like the experts. Let's look at a paragraph that involves some subtle plagiarism that's most likely unintentional and talk about where the student goes wrong. Here's the passage I want you to think about. While the moment when Arthur pulls the sword from the stone is arguably the, quote, flip of the switch that changes the community of Malory's text forever, the moment when King Arthur establishes the Order of the Round Table is actually much more important. Here is where he transfers power to knightly agents. He will be eminent in their deeds, while he himself remains safely at home. All right, what are the issues with this paragraph? The ideas are certainly ones that the student could have come up with herself, the idea of pulling the sword from the stone as being like flipping a light switch, as well as the idea that the character of King Arthur is somehow present in the actions of his knights, even if the king himself is safe at home. But at the same time, while the student may have come up with the idea independently, the phrasing sounds really distinct and somewhat, I would say, even unique. It really sounds as if she heard or read the phrases flip of the switch and imminent in their deeds in some of her research. And it sounds as if she internalized them and then reproduced them here. As I said, this may be completely unintentional. You might actually recall some recent news stories about highly respected historians and public intellectuals getting caught up in the same issue. Doris Kearns Goodwin was one of these. It was discovered that her book, The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, had lots of unattributed passages, and in particular, these were drawn from the work of a writer named Lynn McTaggart. In a Time magazine piece, Goodwin acknowledged that she had accidentally plagiarized McTaggart's work, and she noted that although she had frequently cited McTaggart's work throughout her book, her footnotes were full of McTaggart, she had, as she herself said, quote, failed to provide quotation marks for phrases that I had taken verbatim, having assumed that these phrases drawn from my notes were my words, not hers. The larger question is to understand how citation mistakes can happen. This should be a lesson to all of us who conduct research. We have to be very, very careful. And in the example I gave you of the student who used the phrases flip of the switch and imminent in their deeds, well, that student should recheck her notes very carefully and, if necessary, provide proper attribution if it's needed. Okay, so what are the key points to take away from today's lecture? Well, without question, it should be clear to you that when you're working on a project that involves research, one of the most important things to do is give yourself enough time. You're going to need time to read, to reread, to rethink, and maybe even change your topic as your research sends you in new and hopefully interesting directions. Along the lines of the time issue, you should also try to set yourself some deadlines. Even if you end up not making those deadlines, having them will help give your research activities structure. You also need to have some sort of system in place for taking notes. And you have to have an idea as to how you're going to organize all those notes. Every idea or phrase or direct quote must be properly attributed to the scholar who made it first. As I always say to my students, when in doubt, cite. If it's too much citation or we don't really need it, you can always take it out later. But trying to remember a source after you've made use of it in your writing is a mistake that can cost you hours of your precious time. And speaking of time, in our next lecture, we're going to talk about getting started with writing first drafts. In some ways, this can be the hardest part of writing anything. Sometimes, if you've given yourself enough time, it can be really hard to get started because you think, oh, I have plenty of time, so I'll just do the laundry first. Or you could have a looming deadline and out of fear and panic, put off starting until the very last second because the task seems so overwhelming. Next time, I'll give you some strategies for getting started so that you can avoid trying to write beautiful prose at 3 a.m. before a 9 a.m. deadline, or so that you don't end up cleaning out every closet in the house as a way to avoid sitting down at your desk, picking up the pen, or setting your fingers to the keys.